When Scotland's Parliament convened for what seemed like routine business, no one expected the seismic shift that would ripple across the United Kingdom. In a vote cloaked in secrecy and urgency, MSPs passed a motion that would catapult a young royal into the heart of national reverence. Prince George, not yet a teen, had been chosen for an honour that would change the narrative of succession, unity, and monarchy forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The debate in Holyrood began with hushed confusion. The parliamentary docket for the day made no mention of royal business, and yet midway through the session, a confidential addendum was introduced by a cross-party alliance of senior members. The motion, titled Special National Recognition of Royal Youth, passed within 20 minutes, no cameras, no press, no prior leaks. What was most telling was the silence that followed. Leaked internal memos from the Scottish executive revealed that lobbying had begun weeks prior, orchestrated by a discreet group of royal advisors stationed in Edinburgh. These advisors, whose identities were redacted, had reportedly pushed for Prince George to be awarded Scotland's highest chivalric honour, the Order of the Thistle. What made this motion so startling was not just the name chosen, but the absence of any public discourse. Both unionist and nationalist factions, normally at each other's throats, reacted with a rare and eerie stillness. Some whispered this was a unifying gesture to remind Scots of their royal connection. Others, more cynical, saw it as a last-minute political chess move by the monarchy. The Order of the Thistle, rooted in ancient Scottish tradition, carries a weight far heavier than ceremonial garb. It has only ever been awarded to those deemed protectors of Scotland's heritage, and never, in living memory, to a child. That's what raised eyebrows. Why George? Why now? What was Scotland signalling to the monarchy, and what was the monarchy signalling back? As headlines erupted across media outlets, most failed to capture the deeper undertones. This was not a decorative title, it was an anchor. An anchor to a kingdom whose seams had been quietly fraying. George wasn't just being honoured, he was being marked. And whether he was ready or not, Scotland had placed something profound and ancient on his shoulders. But as political murmurs echoed through Holyrood, another storm was brewing behind Balmoral's stone walls. An ancient order was being prepared for a child who had no idea what legacy he was about to inherit. At precisely 11:42 p.m, a red-sealed envelope arrived at Balmoral Castle. Inside, a coded communiqué from Scotland's presiding officer and a private request addressed not to the king but to Catherine. What followed was not a mother's delight, but a queen-in-waiting's reckoning. Catherine knew this was more than a ceremonial gesture, it was a summons to redefine the Crown's relationship with Scotland through her son. The moment her eyes scanned the lines, each word cloaked in formality but pulsing with political intent, her breath caught. She didn't wake William at first. She sat in silence, the letter trembling faintly in her hand, as though even paper understood the burden it now passed to her family. When she finally entered their private chamber, William was reading, his voice calm until he saw her expression. Catherine didn't speak for a moment, then handed him the page with steady hands. "They've chosen George," she said. He read and reread, then placed the page down as if afraid of what accepting its truth would invite. There was no precedent for this. No preparation, and yet, there was memory. Because Catherine remembered. She remembered the afternoon in Windsor's private garden, years ago, when Queen Elizabeth had taken her aside after church. No cameras, no aides, just legacy. The Queen had hinted then at something unspoken, that Scotland's loyalty to the monarchy would not be passed through Charles, but through the child who bore the future in his eyes. "Scotland watches from the mist," she'd said softly. "One day they will look to George, not because of law, but because of instinct." That phrase returned like a tidal wave now, crashing against Catherine's mind as she read the formal request. Scotland wished for George to receive the Order of the Thistle and serve as its youthful representative of continuity and unity. But unity came at a price. Catherine knew what Scotland remembered. Her own history in St Andrews was not just tabloid folklore, it was memory ingrained in Scottish hearts. She had walked cobblestones long before she wore designer heels, Her face was known not as a duchess, but as a student, a peer, someone real. That connection had always made Scotland treat her differently. And now, it made her son the chosen one. But emotion clouded strategy. For every ounce of pride swelling in her heart, there was fear. Fear that George's innocence was being weaponized. Fear that Charles would see this as a threat. Fear that George, thrust into symbolic power before he could fully grasp its weight, might one day resent her. And just as her thoughts began to spiral, another voice returned Princess Anne's, echoing from a private meeting months prior. "Be careful what thrones you place on a child," she'd warned quietly, the steel behind her words more piercing than any scepter. Catherine now sat alone in the drawing room, firelight casting long shadows across the red-sealed envelope, as if history itself was waiting for her consent. Outside, the Highlands lay still. Inside, decisions were being made that would shake the realm. She reached once more for the letter, her fingers tracing the edges of destiny. Knowing this wasn't merely about honor, it was about reshaping the crown's future, starting with a boy who was still too young to comprehend the weight of a nation's gaze. And while Catherine stared into the firelight that night, George slept unaware until a ceremonial directive, locked away for decades, was retrieved from a vault beneath the castle of May. Most believe the Order of the Thistle to be mere pageantry, but its origins are tangled with rebellion, redemption, and forgotten succession plans. Within its emerald green sash lies a covenant known only to a sacred few. And now, for reasons still shrouded in coded language, that covenant points to Prince George as its next bearer. Long before George's name entered the chambers of Holyrood, the Order of the Thistle carried a legacy that predated even the formal union of crowns. Formed in shadows, sealed by oaths, and reactivated only during moments of national reckoning, it was never intended to decorate, it was designed to designate. Within the private vaults of the royal archives, buried beneath decades of ceremonial repetition, lay a page few dared revisit. Appendix Windsor IV. This document, long whispered about among the highest royal archivists, detailed a concept lost to modern monarchy, the Highland heir. A symbolic protector chosen not by bloodline alone, but by circumstance and spiritual alignment, to serve as a living emblem of unity when the bond between Scotland and the Crown threatened to unravel. And in its barely legible margin, penned in Queen Elizabeth II's own hand during the fragile days of 1952, one haunting line: "Should fracture ever linger near the realm, look not to the throne but to the child crowned by spirit." The monarch, barely crowned herself at the time, had foreseen something others ignored a moment, when the child of the future would be called to mend what the elders had failed to hold together. That moment, by all signs, had arrived. The symbolic power of Scotland's ceremonial roles cannot be overstated. These were never decorative performances, they were sacraments dressed in state robes. To wear the thistle was not to be seen. It was to be bound to history, bound to land, bound to a people whose love for monarchy had always been conditional, and whose patience with Westminster was quickly thinning. But George had not chosen this. He had merely inherited the tide. Behind closed doors, meetings were convened between Crown representatives and senior members of the Scottish Episcopal Church, themselves guardians of ecclesiastical nuance that hadn't seen daylight in generations. The discussions were not broadcasted, they were encrypted. Codified references to ancient blessings, Highland compacts, and spiritual anointing rites were revived from dusty ledgers that hadn't been touched since the days of Edward VII. There, in whispered agreement, the phrase resurfaced like an ancient bell tolling across the hills: "Heir Protector of the North." It wasn't an invented title, it was a buried one, and Prince George had become its unsuspecting vessel. This wasn't just a ceremonial elevation. It was the activation of a spiritual contract, signed long before George's birth, and revived in a moment of political fracture that demanded symbolism stronger than law. Scotland wasn't handing George a medal, it was handing him its last thread of trust in the monarchy. And just as the ancient guardians prepared George's emerald regalia, a separate envelope was delivered to Clarence House, sparking a chain reaction that would see Camilla's influence rapidly unravel. When the royal household confirmed the honour, the name missing from the press release spoke louder than all else. Queen Camilla. The woman crowned beside Charles was deliberately omitted from the Scottish ceremony's inner circle, and when she found out, her fury ignited an emergency audience at Windsor, where the king was forced to choose between his wife and his heir's future. The press noticed the absence immediately. Major outlets scanned every official detail, every photograph, every briefing, and found no trace of Camilla's name or role in the planned investiture. No honorary mention, no appearance, not even a diplomatic justification. Within hours, royal correspondents were whispering that the omission wasn't accidental. It was strategic, and inside Clarence House, tempers exploded. One aide, speaking under strict anonymity, revealed Camilla was blindsided. Her face reportedly pale with disbelief as she read the bulletin. She demanded clarification. None came. Another aide was more blunt. This was Catherine's show. Camilla was never even briefed. Behind the scenes, a delicate hierarchy was being quietly reshaped. Those within the royal household understood that ceremonial protocol was not just tradition, it was currency, and Catherine had spent hers carefully. As the mother of the honoree and the symbolic bridge between George and Scotland, she was given and had fiercely protected the right to approve every detail of the event. According to multiple internal sources, she exercised that right with striking precision. Camilla, who had once shared royal stages with confident ease, was now publicly absent from the most symbolically charged ceremony in years. The silence from King Charles was deafening. He neither acknowledged the controversy nor soothed the fury behind palace doors. But those closest to him knew this wasn't apathy, it was paralysis. Any intervention would expose the internal rift playing out under public scrutiny. And Charles had been here before. The year was 1997 then. Diana, the fallout, the silence, the consequences. This time, he scribbled a single line in his private journal, later leaked by a trusted but conflicted aide. We must not repeat 1997. In the shadows of this unfolding storm, a quieter figure moved with surprising clarity. Prince Edward, long the steady hand in chaotic tides, met with Camilla in private. He didn't console her. He warned her. This isn't about exclusion, he said, plainly. It's succession. The words cut through the fog. The monarchy wasn't snubbing Camilla. It was signalling its direction. Toward George, toward Catherine, toward the north. And as public sentiment grew louder in support of Catherine's strategic brilliance, Camilla's position, long protected by Charles's affection, began to erode beneath the weight of national symbolism. Catherine's image was rising, not just as a mother, but as a stateswoman of profound foresight. When Scotland's First Minister formally requested her presence at the ceremony in full state attire, it was no longer just about George. It was about Catherine assuming the silent mantle of Queen in waiting, without needing a single crown on her head. And as Camilla's absence became symbolic, Catherine's presence grew formidable, especially when Scotland's First Minister requested her attendance in full state attire. As the chamber doors opened and the sound of ancient bagpipes filled the hall, Scotland's Parliament rose not for a monarch, but for a child. Prince George, flanked by his parents and wearing the Thistle's insignia, stepped into history. What was meant to be ceremonial turned into something seismic, as one MSP whispered, "This isn't just tradition, this is preparation." The moment felt suspended in time. The emerald insignia on George's chest gleamed under centuries of symbolism, not simply representing a Scottish honour, but an ancestral pact reawakened. This wasn't just pageantry, it was a restitching of national identity, and Scotland had chosen its thread. All eyes were on George, but it was the composure in his silence that unsettled many. He didn't fidget. He didn't smile too brightly. He bowed at the precise angle once taught to him by his great-grandmother, and in that brief gesture, the ghost of Elizabeth seemed to nod from the shadows of history. The chamber, normally governed by party lines and political combat, fell into rare unity. Members of all allegiances stood not out of formality, but out of something older, reverence. Perhaps even hope. The symbolic sword, etched with both the Scottish lion and the Tudor rose, was presented and rested lightly on George's shoulder, sealing the moment. And then came the crest, embroidered not with the name of the monarch, but with the emblem of the Highland Pact, previously unseen in public since the days of George VI. A silence lingered as the final rite concluded, broken only by applause that swelled not with volume, but with weight. Catherine stood still throughout, her posture regal, her eyes reflecting both pride and haunting clarity. She knew the cost of this moment. She had not only guided it, she had gambled everything on it. A nation's emotions now rested on her son's shoulders, and it was no longer just about keeping a monarchy alive. It was about forging a crown that would have to bend to survive. As the cameras flashed, capturing George's face for front pages, across the world, Scottish media reframed the moment with a phrase that would soon dominate headlines: the new link of the crown. In that phrase lay a quiet truth that George had become more than a prince. He was now the symbol of a future monarch that Scotland could not ignore. The ceremony was over, but its tremors were only beginning to be felt. For while Westminster debated symbolism and succession, Holyrood had already acted. They had made their move, and in doing so, they had pushed the crown one step closer to either reinvention or rupture. But while the crowds cheered outside Holyrood, a sealed letter was being hand-delivered to Archbishop Justin Welby, marked with one chilling instruction: for investiture Phase 2. Behind the gilded gates of Lambeth Palace, a document buried since 1984 was retrieved and unsealed. Titled Clarion, Section 9, it detailed steps for a rare ecclesiastical elevation of a royal heir in the event of national fragmentation. With George now ceremonially honoured in Scotland, Phase 2 had been triggered, and the Crown's secret contingency plan was in motion. For decades, Clarion had remained hidden, known only to a triad of senior ecclesiastical figures, and one reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. The document, composed during a time of Cold War tension and whispers of constitutional instability, was never meant for public release. Clarion wasn't law. It was prophecy, backed by protocol. Its authorship was listed only as Concilium Perennis, a cryptic reference believed to signify a secret clerical council with roots in both Canterbury and Holyrood. And within the parchment's coded directives was one line that now shook the religious core of the monarchy: "The child of balance shall bear the thistle before the crown, and his spirit must be sanctified before inheritance is legitimized." That child, the document now made clear, was George. The wording wasn't metaphorical, it was procedural. Clarion set out a map, an ecclesiastical path to position a royal heir as a spiritual link in times when the political framework of the realm began to show cracks. With Scotland's ceremonial embrace of George, the trigger had been met. What followed was not a choice, but an obligation. For the Archbishop of Canterbury, the timing could not have been worse. The Church had already been navigating turbulent waters, and the idea of reviving a veiled protocol created by a monarch now past was politically radioactive. Yet Clarion had one final authority imprinted across its final page: Queen Elizabeth's personal seal. It was unmistakable. The Queen had signed off on it in full, in her own handwriting, decades earlier. And William, having only just been briefed in confidence, reportedly stared at the document for nearly an hour in stunned silence. This wasn't speculation. His mother had planned it. His son had been chosen. And now, the Church had been summoned to act. Initially, Archbishop Justin Welby resisted. The implications were far too vast. But the instructions were undeniable, and so was the moment. The elevation wasn't about faith, it was about continuity, disguised as divinity. It was about binding George not just to Scotland, but to the spiritual integrity of a fractured kingdom. Clarion demanded one final step before execution: activation of something darker, more cryptic. The concluding line read simply: "Activate Appendix, Windsor 4, Obsidian Key." It was a term almost no one outside the Crown Chamber had heard in modern times, but those who did knew exactly what it meant. The Obsidian Key was not a thing, it was a process. A binding rite stored within the forgotten annexes of royal protocol, one that required both spiritual affirmation and bloodline witness. George's public investiture had opened the door. Clarion had stepped through it. And now, the obsidian key would turn. As preparations began for a sacred Scottish blessing unlike any in centuries, another player stepped from the shadows. Lady Louise, armed with a sealed codex, passed down from Prince Philip himself. Amid the swirl of royal protocols and national ceremonies, one figure had remained silent until now. Lady Louise, long underestimated, emerged carrying Prince Philip's codex and a silver key marked obsidian. Her task? To present the Northern Pact, a forgotten oath that binds the Crown's future to Scotland's stability. George's elevation was no accident. It was legacy, deliberately revived. The codex, long stored in a velvet-lined chest beneath Philip's private study at Wood Farm, was neither public nor ceremonial. It had been entrusted to Louise alone, passed into her hands during her final visit with her grandfather, a moment dismissed by most as symbolic affection, but in truth, a calculated handover. Within its delicate pages lay a stark, chilling declaration. The realm shall tilt north in times of southern fracture, and the child shall rise only when the obsidian is accepted. That phrase, long dismissed as poetic code, had suddenly come alive. Louise had never asked for power, but Philip had seen something others hadn't. Composure. Clarity. An unshakable loyalty not corrupted by ambition. He had chosen her not because of rank, but because of resolve. And now, with George on the precipice of a role never meant to be his so soon, Louise's obligation had matured into action. The Northern Pact, outlined meticulously in Philip's handwriting, detailed an ancient accord made between the Crown and a coalition of Highland clans, one that predated even the modern structure of the United Kingdom. The pact had been drawn in response to the rising tensions of the 20th century, but its mechanisms were forward-facing. Should the monarchy face existential fracture from within, Scotland could become not a threat, but a lifeline. George's ceremonial recognition was the signal. Louise's arrival was the seal. The timing was no coincidence. The codex referenced a time-sensitive alignment, one dependent on ceremonial acceptance, spiritual affirmation, and constitutional silence from Westminster. All three conditions had now been met. Louise, wearing the weight of duty etched into her grandfather's final request, presented the codex to the Crown Chamber without fanfare. The obsidian key, symbolizing unyielding loyalty and incorruptible clarity, was placed on the table beside it. And yet, not all accepted her presence with grace. Camilla, already bruised by her exclusion from Scotland's ceremony, reportedly confronted Louise in a private corridor. The exchange was brief, but unforgettable. "This wasn't meant for you," Camilla said, voice sharp with disbelief. Louise replied with devastating calm, "Scotland was never yours to hold." That moment crystallized the division not between individuals, but between visions for the monarchy. What Louise had done was more than deliver a forgotten oath. She had clarified the stakes. George's rise was no longer ceremonial, it was structural. With the Northern Pact now reactivated, the monarchy's orientation toward Scotland had transformed from symbolic gesture into constitutional signal. And while Charles remained silent, William took notice. For the first time, George's future wasn't tethered to England's throne alone, it had been anchored in Scotland's trust. And the figure who made that possible was not crowned, not titled, but chosen. Lady Louise had turned the key, not to power, but to legacy. And as Lady Louise returned the codex to the Crown Chamber, another storm was rising in Westminster, where Unionist MPs demanded answers from the palace and threatened to challenge the legality of George's appointment. Panic erupted in London. MPs called emergency sessions, pundits cried constitutional breach, and demands for clarification flooded the monarchy. But Catherine, not Charles, stepped forward. In a nationally televised address that halted the country, she revealed the truth behind the Thistle honour and issued a calm, unwavering reminder. This is not a break in tradition. This is the return of one. The tension in Westminster had reached a boiling point. Parliament's floor roared with accusations that the Crown had orchestrated a backdoor succession, that George's elevation in Scotland was not symbolic, but strategic and dangerously opaque. The Prime Minister remained notably neutral, but a coalition of backbenchers initiated a formal request for disclosure, demanding full access to every document related to Protocol Clarion, the Order of the Thistle, and Appendix Windsor IV. What they didn't expect, however, was who would answer them. It was not the king who took the lectern. It was Catherine, without palace handlers, without spin doctors, without even the presence of Charles or William. She delivered the most consequential royal address in a generation. Her tone was neither defensive nor combative, it was resolute. And in every syllable the message was unmistakable. She was not speaking as queen, but for the crown. Catherine spoke of George not as a prince thrust into ceremony, but as a child born into duty. She reminded the nation of the crown's historical role as a stabilizer during political division. She referenced Scotland not as a rebellious territory, but as a partner in Britain's survival. And then, in a move that stunned commentators and critics alike, she read aloud from Queen Elizabeth's private writings lines the public had never heard. "When the nation splinters in silence, send the youngest voice to remind them what binds us." The emotional weight of her delivery broke through the noise. This was not spin. This was conviction. Catherine continued with clarity and courage, weaving motherhood into monarchy, legacy into legitimacy. She never invoked power. She invoked trust. "We did not choose this moment," she said, "but we have honored it with transparency." And then came the line that would echo across every screen, every home, every future textbook. "The crown's strength is not in stone, but in trust." In those 10 words, she redefined monarchy not as entitlement, but as responsibility earned. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Streets, once divided by protest, now filled with vigils of support. Social media surged with praise. Even some within Parliament began to soften, seeing not a usurpation, but a recalibration. And yet, as London reeled from the emotional aftershocks of Catherine's broadcast, Scotland was not finished. For while the rest of the United Kingdom processed her words, Holyrood introduced one final motion, one that no one expected and everyone feared. A formal constitutional amendment was placed on the parliamentary floor bearing a single staggering name, Prince George. But just as the nation exhaled, Scotland delivered one final shock, a motion introduced in Parliament, calling for a constitutional amendment bearing one name, Prince George. In a thunderclap of political audacity, Scotland's Parliament submitted a formal proposal to recognise Prince George not only as an honoured figure, but as future co-sovereign in the event of dissolution. A crown contingency, long considered myth, now stood on the brink of legitimacy. And in the hushed silence of Buckingham Palace, a father realised the future of the monarchy had just leapt a generation. The motion, worded with surgical precision, proposed the establishment of a contingent co-sovereign clause, a constitutional mechanism that, should the United Kingdom formally divide, would affirm Prince George as Scotland's independent royal representative. The clause, buried under dense legislative language, effectively gave Holyrood the power to name its own monarch in the future, with the Crown's implicit blessing. But the most explosive term came tucked near the end. National continuity through the Crown's junior heir. It wasn't a rejection of Charles. It was a preemptive pivot, a nation preparing for two paths. And in both, George stood at the centre. Inside the palace, reaction fractured across invisible lines. Some gasped in disbelief. Others, particularly among the old guard, feared a constitutional nightmare spiralling beyond control. But Charles did not shout. He did not call for legal barricades. Instead, he retired to his study and wrote 6 words in his journal that would not be shared for days. "The crown moves. I must let go." It was not defeat. It was surrender to inevitability. The man who had waited a lifetime for a throne had now become its steward for someone else. And that someone wasn't waiting anymore. William said nothing publicly, but behind the walls of Kensington Palace, his support for Catherine's vision crystallized. He understood what this moment meant, not just politically, but spiritually. The monarchy was no longer simply inherited. It was being sculpted, shaped, and entrusted piece by piece by a nation that was watching every move. And Catherine, with silent precision, had prepared them all for this turning point. The anger, the risk, the doubt, it had all led to this. George was no longer a symbol. He was a contingency, a future, sealed not by law, but by faith. And that faith had now been written into the bones of Scotland's constitutional soul. In a gesture few were allowed to witness, George, guided by Catherine and William, entered the crown chamber at Windsor and placed his Thistle insignia into the central vault, atop a velvet-lined pedestal once reserved only for coronation artifacts. It was not a resignation of title. It was a consecration, a signal that the child who had knelt beneath Scotland's crest now carried a burden far greater than ceremony. He had become the hinge on which two nations could turn. And as the emerald sash was folded and sealed, a new phrase began to spread across the kingdom, a whisper both haunting and hopeful. The North has spoken, and the air has heard. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.